Good evening. This is the August edition of Operation City on a Hill. I'm your host, Robert Maynard. Tonight's show is going to be entitled American Traditionalism Gone Off the Rails. And we're going to talk about, this is a continuing series that I've been doing about the hijacking of American conservatism. And there's, in my opinion, American conservatism has went off track from the kind of principles that it was supposed to conserve. So I want to talk tonight about something, an idea that was labeled by the critics as fusionism. It's a political thinker, Frank Meyer, back in the, this was, 60s. And it was post-World War II conservatism. He was trying to bring it together philosophically, and his critics referred to it as fusionism. I happen to agree with him, even though I got my own version of how it should be presented. But he was making the argument that American conservatism, promoting the traditions of Western civilization, should be a fusion of what is referred to as the individual liberty focus of libertarianism, and the concern of a certain strand of traditionalisms for transcendent value. As a matter of fact, I think the best expression of how this work comes together, because he's making the argument that truth has to be grounded, or our political ideology must be grounded in what Russell Kirk referred to as the permanent things, or transcendent grounding. And the Acton Institute for Religion and Liberty had an essay that they used to promote. The essay was by former Pope John Paul II, who obviously wasn't a member of the Acton Institute, but they were promoting an essay that he wrote called "Truth is the Ground of Freedom." And in the Declaration of Independence, it talks about we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and our whole vision of freedom is grounded in the idea of a foundation for that freedom and absolute truth. And that's where the traditionalism comes from. It's a traditionalism that goes back to the permanent things, the transcendent values that are the ground of our freedom. So I want to suggest that there is more than one strand of traditionalism in Western civilization, but that is the strand that makes it unique, and that is the strand that I believe American conservatism is supposed to be conserving as the bedrock foundation for our individual liberty, which the libertarians are so focused on. So this is the tradition of American conservatism that I think we're getting off track from. So basically, I want to talk, I'm going to go into a video in a little bit, but not right yet, that is referring to the thought of Steve Bannon, who used to be considered the brain of the Trump administration. He was running the campaign, and then he became one of the senior advisors to Trump, and he is basically seen as the intellectual leader of some of these alt-right proponents that are supported what is now being referred to as Trumpism, a version of populism. But there's expressions of this that I think are coming out in our politics that are not being covered as to what is going behind this. Case in point, you have 4 freshman legislatures in the Democratic Party that have been referred to as, they're the club, or they're the group. There's this group of people that Andrea Ocasio-Cortez and the 3 others that they referred to when Trump was saying, if you don't like it here, go back to where you came from. And so, because most of them came from racial minority backgrounds, they were focusing upon the racial aspect of this. But some of the conservatives were supporting Trump and saying this and saying, no, it's because they've been critical of America. So if they don't like it here, they should go back. And one senator who used to be someone that I had a great deal of respect for, and I like his politics, because he focuses upon individual liberty and bases it in the kind of grounding in truth that I that I think is, and that was Rand Paul. But he offered to buy a ticket to Omar. I'm trying to think of her. She was the one from Somalia. She came here from she was 9 years old when she came here, but she was offered to buy her a ticket back to Somalia so she would learn to appreciate America because she was very critical. Now, the question is that goes back to the old saying, America, love it or leave it. Is being critical of American politics and the American nation and the way we do things being unpatriotic? And is that something that American conservatives and those who hold true to American traditionalism should automatically reject as being unpatriotic? I would argue no. As a matter of fact, the American conservatism goes back to the Jewish prophetic tradition, where it's very critical of any measure that doesn't measure, any standard that doesn't measure up to the standard of justice that they're striving for. So you can almost argue that the criticism can be prophetic, but whether now, I'm not arguing that these 4 freshman legislatures are prophets, and I'm not, and although I might agree with some of their critiques, I strongly disagree with their solutions to the problem. I think that, but my question here is not, are they right in terms of solving the problems they're identifying? My question is, do they have a right to be held to make this critique and still be considered patriotic Americans? And I would argue that that's in the best tradition of American conservatism, if it's properly understood. And so I want to, and later on I'm going to go into some of the thought behind some of these mass shootings. There was a manifesto written supposedly by the one that was in El Paso, and he cited the New Zealand shooter as an example of what he was, who had identified himself as eco-fascist. So I don't think the core thought behind some of these, the left and right is playing political gotcha. They're trying to political one-upmanship, and they're not focusing enough, in my mind, on the philosophical foundations that is causing this. They're trying to gain political, both sides. And so I want to take a look at the thought that's driving this, and I think, now I'm not saying that people who are going off track in traditionalism are directly responsible for mass shootings, but what I'm saying is that the people who that did these mass shootings were inspired by an extreme example of a trend that is a part of Western civilization, but it is a trend that was opposed by the trend that I believe is the one that we should be conserving. So first thing I want to start off with is, I'm going to get up with it in just a minute, but there was a video of Steve Bannon giving a speech to a group of Catholic traditionalists. He's talking about traditionalism and what's at stake in his battle against modernity. It's almost like an apocalyptic Western civilization is at stake. It's like the battle of good versus. And I've talked about this, I think it was last time I talked about this book that he was very into called Camp of the Saints. And he uses apocalyptic, that book uses apocalyptic terminology and uses imagery from the Camp of the Saints is imagery from the book of Revelation. So it's the forces of good versus the forces of evil, light and darkness. And what he is referring to, the Judeo-Christian foundations of Western civilization being at stake because of modernity. But I would argue that his identification of those elements that are at stake doesn't represent the best of that tradition. As a matter of fact, it represents a part of Western tradition that tradition was initially opposed to. So I'm not going to go into his video directly because it goes all over the place and it's too long. But there is a Democracy Now! Analyzed it. They sent a reporter there, and so they analyzed it and they talked with him, and they're breaking it down, and they touched on some of the things that I wanted to touch on. So I'm going to, I usually like to have the thing direct from the horse's mouth, but I'm going to show up a video that was produced by Democracy Now! That's touching on some of the aspects of this thought that I think shine a light on this battle within American conservatism we have now in terms of what is traditionalism, what is it, what aspects of our tradition should we try to conserve. So here we go, we're going to start off with the video now.
Green. Talk about the religion that informs Steve Bannon's politics.
Well, so we just talked about kind of the newspaper bio of Steve Bannon and the blue-collar background, but the most interesting line of research for this book is Bannon's religious and intellectual biography. And this is a story that hasn't been told, that I go into some detail in the book. But in the course of my reporting, I asked Steve Bannon, I said, you know, when you were at that Vatican conference, and this wasn't just a Vatican conference, it was a group of far, far right conservative traditionalist Catholics. Bannon name-checked a man named Julius Evola, who was an Italian intellectual and Benito Mussolini's fascist ideologist at the beginning of World War II. And I said, Steve, if you're not an anti-Semite and a Nazi and a white supremacist, as you're often charged with being, but you say you're not, why is it that you are familiar with people like Evola? And he said, oh, you know, when I developed my ideas about nationalism, I went back and was looking for an intellectual edifice to kind of inform these ideas. And to find nationalist thinkers, you really have to go back to the 1930s and the 1940s when those ideas were ascendant. But the real guy who influenced me, Bannon told me, was a man named René Guignon, who was Evola's intellectual godfather. Guignon has a fascinating biography. He was born in France in the late 19th century to a Roman Catholic family, practiced occultism, Freemasonry, and later converted to Sufi Islam and observed the Sharia, which is a very unusual guru, it seems to me, for a guy like Steve Bannon, who is so virulently Islamophobic. But Guignon was the founder of a religion, a kind of religious philosophy known as primordial traditionalism. That's capital T, traditionalism. And primordial traditionalism holds that there is common spiritual truths, unifying spiritual truths at the heart of ancient religions like the Hindu Vedanta, Sufism, medieval Catholicism, even paganism. And these are original spiritual truths that were revealed to mankind in the earliest ages of the world, but have been lost in the West by the rise of secular modernity. So Bannon, who was raised in a very traditional Catholic family, who went to a right-wing Catholic military high school and has been steeped in this right-wing Western Civ curriculum, believes, as Guignon does, that we are entering a dark age, that the rise of the Enlightenment in the 1500s has led us toward apocalypse, and that if he can't prop up traditional values and do what Guignon had hoped to do, which was to, quote, restore to the West a traditional civilization, then mankind is going to be destroyed. And that is his animating belief.
And I wanted to turn to Julius Evola in his own words, the monarchist and racial theorist who struck an alliance with Benito Mussolini. His ideas became the basis of fascist racial theory. This is Julius Evola speaking with a French filmmaker in 1971 about what he considered the positive aspects of fascism, and in particular, National Socialism, Nazism.
Il y a des côtés valuables, des aspects valuables, des aspects qui...
There are positive and valuable aspects. Those which I could value are the reconstruction of the authority of the state and the idea of overcoming class conflict toward a hierarchical and corporative formation.
Hiérarchique et corporative.
To some extent, of a military and disciplined style within the nation, in addition to some of their anti-bourgeois proposals. To me, all of that is positive.
That's Julius.
Okay, now, this is coming from Democracy Now!, and they're looking at this more from a recent political, the history of recent political theory. So I don't think they go into the origins of this deep enough. Otherwise, they wouldn't be surprised that Guignon picked up with Sufism or a certain branch of Sufism when Bannon saw him as a intellectual guru, when Bannon sees the problem with Islamic fundamentalism as part of a problem. Sufism has elements of the occult in it. There are aspects of Sufism, matter of fact, properly understood, I think Sufism is the positive aspect of, and today I think a lot of these Muslims from Indonesia follow similar tradition, but there is an aspect within Sufism because it's a mystical part of that goes into the occult. Now I want to talk about what is referred to as primordial traditionalism. Primordial traditionalism goes back to the primary forces of nature. He doesn't talk about that, but there is, and goes back to ancient paganism, which has some premises in it that are absolutely opposed to the premises needed to arrive at individual liberty. And I'll go into that in a minute, because there is a very strong break in the Judeo-Christian tradition from certain aspects of the ancient pagan tradition for a very important reason. The pagan tradition now this is what the philosophical basis or metaphysical basis behind primordial traditionalism, what this guy doesn't go into. You have a divine eternal cosmos that is ruled by these spiritual cyclical laws. You got the seasons, birth and death, and you got the different cycles of the season. Nothing ever happens new. It's a tradition of cyclical. In Western civilization, you can idea progress is a linear tradition. This is a cyclical tradition. And you got cycles of nature, and the cosmos is eternal, and these laws are spiritual, and your fate is tied to them. And that's where the idea of fatalism comes from. An individual human being is merely a tiny speck in this great divine cosmic universe. So we don't have any particular significance. On the other hand, the Judeo-Christian tradition doesn't see the universe itself as divine and eternal. It came about as a result of an intentional act of free will on the part of a creator. So there's a little bit of a different essence about the essence. As a matter of fact, before the Big Bang Theory, a lot of scientists used to argue that creationism can't be true because we all know the universe is eternal. It didn't begin. So and then you have this Big Bang Theory. Oh, well, that might not be the case. Maybe it did maybe it did start out as with a beginning in time, time and space has a beginning. But that's so you've got a willful act of creation on the part of a transcendent creator, and you've got the human being, the human person, as created in the image of that creator. So the implications for human dignity is vastly different. Now, whether you are institutionally Christian or Jewish or whatever is not so important as it is the worldview that behind us. I'm talking now Judeo-Christian tradition, not in an institutional religious sense, but in the sense of the general premises behind Western civilization. The reason why there is a respect in Western civilization for the individual dignity of the human person is because of the basic metaphysical foundations of that civilization from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And starting with, you have, in the Jewish tradition, you had Abraham. Abraham is called out from his family and home, blood and soil, family and home, and goes to a new land and starts a new civilization based upon different principles. So instead of he's breaking away, in the Bible you have two realities. You have what is referred to as God's holiness and God's glory. God's holiness refers to being called apart, that God is separate and distinct, and he calls his people to be separate and distinct. God's glory is God's presence or spiritual immanence within the creation itself. So there is a sense of God being in the creation as immanent, but also separate and transcendent from the creation. And so God calls out an individual, Abraham, to be loyal and to transcendent reality. So your first loyalty comes from truth to transcendent reality and not to blood and soil. So he's called out. So in ancient traditionalism, your first loyalty is blood and soil. You're born in a certain place, you're going to die in that place, and you have kin, you have blood relatives, you got blood. It's called blood and soil. So what ties you together? Holding transcendent truth or your blood and soil? These are two different, not necessarily completely incompatible, but they're the basic. You can reach a kinship through transcendence, and that's what. But you start with transcendent reality, and that's why in St. Paul in the Gospels talks. Not in the Gospels, in the writings of Paul, talks about in Christ there is no male nor female, nor Jew nor Gentile. In other words, the distinctions are transcended by our relationship to a transcendent reality. That brings us together. So, and that was in the Jewish tradition. They came out when Moses led his people. You had Abraham as an individual called out, then he's Abraham as a family, then you had tribes, and eventually a nation. So you got this called out individual from individual, and then it's tribal society, family, tribe, nation. It's a bottom-up philosophy, and is ruled by transcendent reality. So when Moses came out of, and his people came out of the Egypt, he came into the promised land. They came out of a society that Frank Meyer refers to as cosmological society, where the forces of nature were in the forces of politics, and what ought to be and what is, there's no distinction. And the rule of the sovereign was divine and unquestioned, so you didn't have divided authority. You come into Canaan, and they were the chosen people set up what some experts have shown as a stateless society, a society based upon groups of individual rulers or prophets, not prophets, I'm sorry, judges. They didn't have prophets then, that was prophets later. You had their ruled by judges, but the judges were charismatic figures who had no legal authority. The authority has to do with whether or not they could convince the people that they were speaking in the name of God. And even then, if that wasn't enough, they were looking for a time where God would write the law in their heart. So this was something where the authority came from transcendent reality. At the same, roughly, not the same time, but you had the Greek civilization, particularly in Athens, where you had this figure like Socrates. And he's challenging the sophists about the nature of justice. And Socrates running around, not running around, he's walking around having these debates within the city-state with the young people about what is justice. And he's challenging the traditions of the state, and he's challenging all these kinds of traditions in the name of justice. So he gets put on trial and he's going to be executed. He could have gotten away if he would have recanted, but he wouldn't do it because it was more important. And so he was a martyr for the individual conscience and the adherence to transcendent truth, beauty, goodness, transcendent reality, as opposed to the traditions of the polis. And so you got this Greek tradition, you got this existential religious tradition on the terms of the Jews, and you got this Greek philosophical tradition. They both have this tradition of the individual conscience or the individual personality experiencing transcendence as being more fundamental than their experience of blood and soil. So this is what we're coming out of, and now you're seeing in Christianity it's even more radical. You're focusing upon, instead of the chosen people, you're focusing upon the salvation of the soul. The soul is the principle of individuation. And so that is something that is, I would argue, and I've talked about earlier, if you go into the tradition we're facing. We had this that we're promoting in America. The continuation of this was beautifully summed up by this quote, "Operation City on a Hill." We should be a city on a hill. That quote comes from this speech given. What was the name of it? It's a sermon. A model of Christian charity. So you got this vision of being a city on a hill, which is hearkening back to in Revelation, and you talk about the New Jerusalem coming down to be like a shining city on a hill, and they're referring to this transcendent reality, this New Jerusalem that is not historical. It's something to come post-resurrection. So without going into details, so we're looking at a historical transcendent reality as an ideal. So you're never in your earthly existence, you're never going to realize that ideal as a transcendent, perfect ideal. We sometimes critique the left of, some people critique, I don't, my critique is a little bit different. Critique the left of holding America up to an abstract standard instead of the standard of other traditions. Well, yeah, that's what our Pilgrim Fathers did. We shall be a city on a hill, and if we don't live up to that standard, we're subject to criticism. That was the whole basis of this tradition. Whether or not the left is correctly identifying the standard that we should be held up to, the idea that we should be held up to a standard that is, the Jewish prophets didn't tell the Jews, well, at least you're doing better than Babylon. No, they held them up to a standard that is higher than that, because the Jewish people were claiming to be God's people, and the American people wanted to be claimed to become a second Israel, a city on a hill. Then at least we're doing better than the other countries. We're the best country so far. It's not good enough. That's not the standard that we're holding ourselves up to. And so this is what is the traditionalism that we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve this traditionalism that holds to universal values and also has a room for reason? The Enlightenment, is it a disaster like they say so, or a good thing? It depends. You have more than one Enlightenment. The American Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment had an affinity with religion. Enlightenment can go sour if you break faith and reason. Eventually, if you break the spiritual aspect from the rational aspect, you can get to metaphysical principles that will not support freedom. And that's what happened to the French Revolution, and that's what happened eventually. You got Marxism. If you look at the metaphysical train that lead to Marxism, you get scientific materialism. There is no reality other than material forces. And that material forces, and not a whole lot of difference metaphysically between that and the pagan spiritual forces, the forces of nature. The same thing, you're going to have fatalism, or as B.F. Skinner once said, if you're going to apply the scientific method to human behavior, you're going to have to take into account that human beings are not free. So that is the thought. Now I want to go into some of these mass shooters. The one in El Paso, Texas, it's very clear that he held this thought. He wanted to break this invasion of our tradition by immigration, but he also wanted population control because he was an environmentalist, and he wanted population control, and I will go into it later. That's the same philosophy behind some of the three. You got FAIR, you got Numbers USA, and you got Citizens for Immigration Studies, Center for Immigration Studies, all founded by this guy named John Tantros. They were originally a population control environmentalist group, and now they become the three foundations that the right is focusing on so much. They started out on the left, and they're a population control enthusiast based upon environmentalism. So you got this eco-fascism that strides the right-left spectrum in this population control. And you got conservatives historically have rejected this philosophy as antithetical to the dignity of human nature. So we need, I'm a little bit strapped for time. I will go into this kind of thought more in the future, but this has been Robert Maynard, Operation City on a Hill for August, and we'll see you next month. Thank you very much and good night.